Alvarado, PhD, is an assistant professor of communication studies at Dixie State University. Her work specializes in gender and intercultural communication with a focus on the rhetoric of 21st century social movements. Recipient of the 2020 Dixie Awards, Faculty of the Year, Rising Star Award, Dr. Alvarado enjoys horror films and creative writing. I'll turn the time over to you now, Dr. Alvarado.
Thank you, Marilee. Hello, everybody. So really quickly, I want to get a sense of where you are in kind of the library world. So really quickly in the chat, if you can give me some insight as to what your role is, what your job title is perhaps. I want to get an assessment and really kind of tailor the message to the people who are working in the library, right? Honors lecturer, circulation coordinator, assistant librarian, reference librarian. Okay, a lot of librarians, love it. Team, collections, okay. So no more kind of administrative organizational capacity. Wonderful. Reference desk, okay. Now this is important for me. As you'll see at the end of the presentation, we are going to talk about some possible scenarios and how we might de-escalate conflict. And it's interesting, as I was coming up with these scenarios, I was thinking, I understand the library from a faculty perspective, but there are specific issues that arise that are specific to your job. So it's nice to know kind of that there's a multitude of people that work in the library in different capacities. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So today's presentation is all about de-escalation amid the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, often I'm going to ask to check in just to make sure that you all can see my PowerPoint. So if anybody, and I'll probably rely on Brandon, give me a thumbs up if you can see it. Perfect. All right. So today we're going to be talking about de-escalation and conflict. Now, conflict is something that is contextually situated. It is informed by geography, environment, identity, what happened before the conflict, right? So it's already a messy and complex thing. But what's unique about conflict in our contemporary moment is the ways that we are all negotiating conflict amid a pandemic, right? Early in March, when the social distancing was first being enforced, there was a really adept metaphor for describing our situation, right? Where the virus really functions as a storm that we're all surviving. It is not fair to say that we are all trying to survive on a similar vessel, right? Some of us have been able to transition to Zoom working efficiently, but we're struggling with childcare, right? Some of us lost our jobs and as a result are struggling with healthcare. Some people are immune compromised and have to be extra careful about their interactions on a daily basis. And other people aren't immune compromised and are really upset about their daily lives being disrupted, right? And so all of this to say that conflict in this context is going to be much more complicated, right? The virus has affected us in a number of ways that we can really attribute to frames, right? On an individual basis, we've been affected. On a micro, rather, meso, the groups, the categories, the identities that we have also impact conflict and have impacted our negotiation of the virus. And finally, that kind of macro lens, right? What's happening on an institutional basis, our daily practices, the ways that we perform our job have been fundamentally changed because of COVID. So more specifically, thinking about conflict in these three distinct frames, in the micro frame, or rather interpersonally, the COVID has disrupted normal life. We can't attend events, we can't see people like we used to. As a result of the pandemic, we now have new communication expectations and violations, right? Where shaking hands, particularly in Western US America, was the standard form of greeting. We know shaking hands is a big no-no now, right? You might have sneezed in your hand, we might contract it, right? Wearing face masks in different buildings when you're inside, right? Social distancing, where US Americans in particular have always been big about personal space. Now there's different implications behind why it's important to keep 6 feet of distance between folks. From a meso perspective, we also have people who've missed opportunities, gatherings, And not only that, but really we're living in a very bifurcated political context, right? Where political affiliation has become connected with response to the virus, which is also contributing to conflict, right? Feelings of being threatened as well. And from a macro perspective, we have a lot of people dealing with economic uncertainty, right? Whether they've lost a job, whether, people in the entertainment industry and hospitality industry have been completely changed or impacted rather by the virus. People are losing jobs, particularly students. And finally, kind of the biggest macro change that is really applicable to you all is these new policies that are in place that need to be adhered to, right? To protect employees and guests. And so when we're talking about conflict, we have to understand that often conflict is about more than the actual interpersonal exchange, right? There's the thing that sets off the conflict, and yet we know that there are different frames at play that shape our reaction to it. So when we're talking about interpersonal conflict, specifically in the library context, it's really rooted in the perception that there are differing goals, right? More specifically, people react as though there are different goals and there's not enough of some resource, and that some person is in the way of that first person acquiring that resource, right? Now, interpersonal conflict can exist without any kind of outward expression. Those of you that are familiar, maybe you identify as conflict avoidant, know that sometimes people just kind of maybe non-verbally communicate frustration and walk away. But in this context, we're going to be talking about the conflict that is actually communicatively enacted, right? Conflict is present when a person's perceptions of struggle are communicated. Specifically verbally, there's an altercation. It's not just someone who's going to, internalize their anger, right? There's some form of communication where the conflict is escalating. And how we respond to that conflict really can work twofold, right? How we respond can either accelerate the conflict, escalate the conflict, or it can lead towards a productive management. And that's why we have to be very attuned to how we communicatively respond when conflict arises. So more specific, or going back a little bit, we talked about those different frames. If we're thinking about that interpersonal micro frame, identity plays a huge role in how we perceive conflict, how we engage in conflict, and how we maybe seek to resolve conflict. Now, identity can be identified as how we see ourselves based on some socially constructed category, right? They could be connected to education, gender, race, ethnicity, age, religious affiliation, right? How we see ourselves and how other people see us. And identity is something that's constantly negotiated through our interpersonal exchanges with others, and something that's always present outside of ourselves. Now, hypothetically, and I want you to think about this, think about the last conflict that you encountered or engaged or came about your way, right? How did identity or cultural difference impact the conflict? Did it, right? Now, where I can easily, and I actually do teach a class where I emphasize and spend time talking about several identity categories. For the sake of today's presentation, I'm going to focus on two identity categories to really accentuate my point with regard to identity. So first, gender. Gender is an identity category or gender designation often dictates how we communicate, right? So in my gender communication class, I always tell my students, I'm going to give you the hypothetical. Let's say your friend had a baby, but they wanted to keep the gender or sex secret because they wanted it to be a huge surprise. You go to the delivery room and they hand you the baby. They say, "This is Molly, my daughter." How does your communication towards Molly change? "Oh my gosh, she's so beautiful. Look at how dainty she is. Those eyelashes. Oh my gosh, do you hear her? She's going to be a singer. She's destined to be a ballerina," right? Same scenario. Now I hand you my son, Max. How does your communication change? "Oh my gosh, look at this little stud muffin. Look at he's a lady killer. Oh my gosh, you see him kicking? He's going to be a soccer star, right? So immediately gender, how we communicate plays a role, right? When really it's just, a drooling, crying baby. But specific in adulthood, right? If we think about constructs like politeness, humor, or anger, think about the ways that gender is reinforced through these styles of communication, right? Now, I want to be careful here and accentuate that I'm not generalizing by any means, right? We know that gender is complex and that people aren't confined to specific communication styles. And yet, if we think about politeness, what gender is often more disciplined to be polite, right? If we think about humor and the types of humor, right? Whether we use cursing, whether we use references to violence, right? What gender typically enacts that type of communication? And if we think about anger and the ways that we communicate anger, whether physically or non-verbally, again, very influenced by gender. The final example I'll give you is the tension between direct and indirect communication, right? So the scenario of you're in a meeting, the AC is cranked up and it's very cold. An indirect communication style might be, are you feeling a little chilly? Is it just me? I'm feeling some goosebumps, right? How are you? You look cold, right? Versus direct, it's really cold in here. Can we maybe, turn up the AC, right? Again, I don't need to say it, but you all know which gender typically enacts what style of communication, right? Or another example, the dreaded, are you hungry dilemma, right? An indirect communication style might be, are you hungry? What's the last time you ate? Oh, my stomach's kind of rumbling, right? Versus, I'm hungry, let's go eat, right? So again, gender significantly impacts the style of communication and heavily, not dictates, but informs how conflict is enacted. Another identity category that heavily impacts conflict is age, right? Discrimination or ageism, discriminatory behaviors as a result of age. Now, this works twofold, right? Typically, age communicates credibility, authority, expertise, right? And we know that if someone is younger, they're going to be less likely to be taken seriously, less likely to be associated with credibility. And conversely, if someone is older, right, it might be that similar perspective. Attitudes relative to age can impact who is respected and given authority. And in a library context, if there is a younger person who is responsible for maybe enforcing a policy, that could create some tension, right? Now, as I said at the start, I could easily go through race, ethnicity, education level. Every identity intersection really shapes how conflict is enacted. But for the sake of today, I just wanted to accentuate gender and age so that we have an understanding of how that may impact communication. Now, kind of the central quote here that I want to emphasize is, we cannot control what happens in the world. We can control how we respond to it. There's a really beautiful Buddhist story related to getting hit by an arrow. And really the moral of that story is, we can't control the arrow hitting us, but we can control how we respond to that arrow, right? Whether we're going to freak out and seek help, or whether we're going to remain calm and try to address the wound. In a similar capacity, conflict is really reliant on how we respond to it. I'd love to tell you that you're never going to encounter conflict in your life, but we all know that's not true, right? And so let's talk about conflict and how, and I'd like to offer you 5 strategies for how you can de-escalate situations. Now, the library context in particular is a space of variety of resources, right? You all are the hub of any academic institution. And in addition to being responsible for the daily operations of your space and for providing resources to a number of people in different capacities, you are now tasked with the responsibility of enforcing social distancing practices to promote the safety of the entire community. And so that inevitably, not inevitably, potentially runs the risk of creating conflict, right? Particularly when people don't want to adhere to these social practices. So de-escalation is really the skill of reducing the intensity of a conflict or a potentially violent interaction. Now, I'm fairly certain that I don't need to review a first approach, but just in case I do, right? Whenever you're tasked with the responsibility of enforcing a policy or perhaps correcting a behavior, your first approach is really to be specific, be concise, and be directive in a way that communicates respect and professionalism, right? So you've all had the situation where maybe a student is in the wrong line to check out a book, right? This is pre-COVID. Being specific, excuse me, student, would you mind going to this line for this resource that you want, right? So communicating respect, reverence for the other person, being mindful of your gestures, right? Because we know that the ways that we approach that kind of directive might be misconstrued. So your first attempt is always what you all already know, right? Be specific, be concise, and be clear about what you want the individual to do. Now, this presentation or workshop really deals with what happens when that doesn't work. You were direct, you were specific, you were concise about your request, and you're immediately met with conflict, right? Someone is resisting the command that you have given them. And so what I'd like to talk about is 5 strategies that you can employ to de-escalate conflict. Now, these strategies are not formulaic. They are not sequential, right? Instead, think of them as different tools in your tool belt that you can employ given the situation, right? Whatever is going on at that time is going to inform your response to it. So let's talk about these strategies and what they might look like, right? So first, strategy number 1, being empathetic and non-judgmental. I'd like to show a video very quickly to really kind of establish a definition for empathy. Oh, go. And then Brandon, I'm going to be looking towards you to make sure that my video and audio are working. Can everybody see? Yes, okay.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you can climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with "at least." And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
Okay, give me a second here. Can you all see my slide, my PowerPoint? Perfect. I'm a huge fan of Brené Brown, but really emphasizing that empathy is about feeling that emotion that the person is communicating. So even though you might not agree with what they're feeling, even though their response might not be justified, try not to judge or discount their feelings, right? Keep in mind that what that person is experiencing in that moment might be the most important thing in their life, right? Very often, so I have a 3-year-old daughter, you know, and those of you that have our parents know that toddlers freak out over some silly things, right? I wanted the orange cup, not the blue one. My cookie, I wanted it cut like this, not like that, right? And often as kind of rational human beings, we think, why are you freaking out, right? This is not a big deal. But in that moment, that is the most important thing for that toddler. When conflict arises and someone responds, we don't know where they're at. And so we have to approach the situation as if it is something that is very important to them in that moment. So some strategies for how you can communicate empathy is to validate the feeling, even though you don't agree with it, right? So I see you're really frustrated right now. You're really angry. I can see that right now. Ask clarifying, open-ended questions to understand their position, right? Maybe they're very upset with you because you asked them to put the face mask over their nose and mouth. Ask, have you been here before? Have you had a negative experience with someone else telling you that, right? Try to understand where they're coming from and communicate back what they're feeling. I can't tell you how often, and I don't want to reduce conflict to, you know, toddler tantrums, but the act of parenting has really reminded me how we're all kind of little kids sometimes in different ways. And with my daughter and with people, when conflict arises, to communicate what they're feeling is to really communicate a willingness to understand them, right? So I see that you're very upset right now. I want, you know, I don't want you to be upset. Like, let's talk. So strategy number 1, show empathy, try to be non-judgmental. Strategy number 2 for de-escalating a situation, and this is a little easier with COVID, respect personal space, right? We know very often that space communicates aggression and hostility. So if you see a conflict escalating, you want to be mindful of your body position relative to theirs. The more personal space you have, the more kind of respect is non-verbally communicated. They don't feel physically threatened, right? If for whatever reason you need to approach the person, explicitly say why so they don't feel it's a threat. Now, I was thinking about, you know, what context might like a librarian have to approach someone. But say, for example, you get into a conflict regarding a study room and you have to walk past that person to maybe exit the room. Communicate that you're going to step over them to leave so they don't see it as a threat. So strategy number 2. Strategy number 3, use non-threatening nonverbals. Keep calm when a situation is escalating, right? The more that a person loses control, the less likely they are to listen to you and the more likely they are to react to your nonverbals. Those of you that have partners know this all too well, right? If you get into conflict with your partner, you both stop talking, you start fixating on every little nonverbal gesture, right? Like, oh, so now they're mad, they're sitting like that. Or, oh, they're looking at me like that. They're apologetic, right? Or maybe they want to be apologetic. So you want to be mindful when you encounter conflict that your gestures, your facial expressions, your movements, your tone of voice are communicating that you are non-threatening, right? You never want to meet someone who is heightened and irate with the same energy. Typically that continues to escalate. You want to be the person to bring it down. So some tips to how you can communicate non-threatening nonverbals is to make sure that your tone and your body language are neutral, right? Avoid crossing your arms, avoid putting your arms on your hips, avoid pointing in a way that's condescending and maybe communicates that you're patronizing the individual. Instead, Stand loose, keep your arms in front of you, and don't stand defensively. Soften your gaze so that you communicate a desire to understand, not escalate. Strategy number 4. If the situation continues to escalate, typically it becomes an issue, or rather a power struggle, where the individual starts to ignore the request and instead starts to challenge you with questions. This is an attempt to redirect, or excuse me, you want to always redirect to the issue at hand. So if you're asking a person to, for example, please maintain social distancing at the checkout counter, and their thought is, well, who are you? Where do you work? How long have you been here? Who's your boss, right? A lot of these challenging questions turn into a power struggle. In those situations, you want to ignore the challenge, but not the person, right? I see you're really upset right now. I just need you to maintain social distance, please. Bring the focus always back to what you want the person to do. Don't get into a game of answering questions. And then finally, and the most important step, I think, is if you're being ineffective, stop, right? If the situation feels unsafe, leave and call for help or support. Be aware of your surroundings should a conflict arise, and always listen to your intuition. So one text that I've read in my life that really profoundly changed my life is The Gift of Fear by Gavin de Becker. For those of you that are unfamiliar with Gavin de Becker, he is a leader in threat assessment, works with the FBI, also runs really kind of a company that protects these like A-list celebrities from stalkers and threats. And Gavin de Becker is huge on emphasizing the need to listen to our intuition. This is the textbook. So actually, when I was doing my master's at Cal State Long Beach, I had an opportunity to actually go to a retreat that de Becker and Associates were hosting. A couple of areas that I specialize in are sexual assault, bystander intervention, and stalking. And what Gavin de Becker emphasizes is that we are the only species on the planet that question our intuition, right? If an animal feels threatened or they feel they're going to be attacked, they react, right? Think of your dog immediately barking when they sense danger, right? Or a lion reacting right away because they know intuitively that something is not wrong. We as a human species rationalize our fear instead of seeing it as a gift, as a warning sign, as a glaring light that something is wrong. And so if you are in a conflict and you can sense that it is escalating and it is going to be, there's violence that's going to be involved, get away from the situation. 2 quotes from the text that I really love. Intuition is always right in at least 2 important ways. It is always in response to something. It always has your best interest at heart. And listen to your intuition. I don't know what might be best for you in some hazardous situation because I don't have all the information, but you will have all the information. So pay attention to your environment. Okay, what I'd like to do now is share scenarios with you all. Well, actually, let me stop for a second. Does anybody have any questions or anything that's coming up for you right now? Doesn't look that way. Okay, so what we're gonna do is I'm actually gonna offer you different scenarios of escalating conflict. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put you in breakout rooms where I'd like you to have 5 minutes of dialogue with your peers and come up with a game plan for what strategies you would employ to de-escalate the situation. So let me go ahead and present to you the first scenario. Oh, someone commented, the book is helpful for showing that situations and behaviors from people trigger that gut feeling. It was useful to me to understanding why certain things made. Yes, Melanie, exactly. I am a huge advocate and fan of the text. I think if you're gonna read one book, it's that one. Well, with regards to safety, right? Okay, so the first scenario that I would like you all to, in your groups to talk about. Can you see my screen, Brandon? Yes, okay. Scenario number 1. Your library has a strict social distancing policy that requires people to maintain 6 feet of distance at all times. At the library checkout, you notice students are clustered together, not adhering to the policy. Your initial attempts to explain policy to the group are not successful. One of the students insults your appearance and tells their friends to not listen to you. What do you do? So this person, you've made a kind initial attempt to please maintain social distancing, and the student responds by insulting your appearance. Let me go ahead and get y'all, and I think Brandon, you might be the person that has access to the rooms. Maybe I do. Or maybe Marilee. Yeah, I'm not seeing the
I can
option
put
here.
people into rooms.
Oh, perfect. That would be great. Thank you, Brandon. So let's have a quick 5-minute discussion, and then we'll go ahead and reconvene at 1:37 and talk about what are some of the strategies that you would employ in that situation. Hi, folks. Did we have a lot of people leave?
Yeah, most everyone should have left. There's still 20 seconds before people will automatically be kicked.
Oh, that's right. That's right. Okay. I always forget about that with breakout rooms.
So people are probably just finishing up their conversations.
That's right.
Or left to have a Friday afternoon cocktail.
Right. That should be a part of this as well.
Oh, yeah.
All right, everyone's back.
Awesome. So I'd love to hear from someone who talked through the scenario with their group. What did you all as a group decide? How would you respond to that situation?
I think our group tended to agree that it was maybe a good approach to just acknowledge a little bit of like, yes, this is not what we all want to be doing, or this is a lot. These rules might seem like overkill, might be inconvenient. Just acknowledge that fact, but then still ask people to cooperate and comply. I know this might not be the greatest. Still going to have to ask you to follow the policy. And if it goes personal, I think this is a strategy I use sometimes, is just asking people to help me do my job. This may not be what either of us wants to be doing, but it is my job to, enforce these. So even if you don't agree with it, can you help everybody out here and just follow the policy and get this done?
Yeah, Melanie, I completely agree. I think communicating that you understand that frustration goes a long way, right? To disarm someone because they feel validated. And for you to even that help me do my job is really emphasizing this ethic of collaboration, right? Like, I'm in this with you. I get it. It's frustrating. That goes a long way when it comes to de-escalating. Someone who is invested in, really, if someone's insulting your appearance, that they're operating from a different maturity standpoint already, right? Nice. Okay, let's try another scenario.
Right, so I had one other comment that
Please.
I think it's okay too to say how not normal this is. I mean, just recognizing that, this is abnormal for us and that we're all trying our best. I think that goes a long way as well.
Absolutely, Brandon. And this is why I really wanted to emphasize the context of this conflict, right? We don't know how the pandemic has impacted that individual. And to emphasize that we know it's frustrating, we know this is different, goes a long way. Just so a lot of people just want to be validated, right? Okay, let's go to another scenario. I trust you can see my screen. Yes, Brandon? Okay. You are an 18 to 20-year-old undergraduate student employee that is responsible for sanitizing the study rooms after every reservation. As a group leaves, you notice the following group, who is older than you, is rushing to the study room. You stop the group and inform them of the sanitation policy, to which the group responds, "It's fine, just leave us." The group proceeds to put their possessions on the table. How would you respond? And to engage that identity dynamic, how would this dynamic change if you were a woman and the group were all male? And Brandon, I think you might have to put us in groups again. And thank you for sending the question. Let me know if you need me to send those to chat or through chat.
Sure, yeah, if you'll send that to me, I can send that out because they've changed like our last version.
Oh, yes, yes.
I think these might be the same room, so have fun.
Or Brandon, actually, I was thinking, since there's not a lot of people, what if we just kind of workshop this together?
Sure.
What do y'all think? Y'all seem pretty responsive. Yeah? Okay, cool. Chris is for it, so is Melanie. So what do you all think? How would you respond to this?
Since they're already in the room, I might just let it go.
Okay. Yeah,
Or hand them wipes and say, do it yourself.
That's the wipes. I mean, I think if a group is invested in kind of pursuing whatever they're out to pursue, there is a level of, where there's nothing we can do, right? As much as we want to. Rachel, I heard you saying something along the lines of tell them to do it themselves. Yeah. Well, how could we do that? How could we maybe reframe the issue and make them responsible for it? How could you communicate that in a way that seeks to de-escalate?
I would phrase it as, I'm sorry, I'm on a bit of a delay here.
No worries.
But I would phrase it more as, oh, I don't want to be in your way. Here are the wipes. You can take care of it. Let me get out of your way. More as a service to them.
Absolutely, right? Communicating care and consideration, and you all have a degree of agency, but no, this is the policy, and so I'll leave these here for you, right? Particularly if people are communicating that they are rushed, they're not invested in engaging you, right? Someone else, how would this dynamic change? Like, can you speak to the age dynamic here, or perhaps the gender dynamic? How might that shape the conflict?
I think that both in the previous scenario and this one, there's some benefit perhaps in making them think of others and not just of themselves. One of the issue of a pandemic is that we're all in this together. If you're not interested in protecting yourself, perhaps you'd be interested in protecting other people, especially those that might have a disability or a health condition that requires extra protection against the virus. So, just remind people that perhaps you shouldn't be quite so self-interested and more community interested.
I love that dynamic, Mark. It's like, how do I communicate don't be selfish in a way that's empathetic and caring? But yes, I agree. I think this is a context like never before, right? A global pandemic, technology is in our lives, like it's just different circumstances. And so really to communicate, I know this is difficult, we're doing this for the most vulnerable among us, is a great strategy to reframe the conflict. So it's not just about me being inconvenienced through sanitation, right? I saw in the chat someone's approach, Valerie. Yes, help me do my job angle is huge, right? Sometimes when people are frustrated, it's difficult for them to see you beyond your immediate role, right? So reminding people, hey, I'm a person here trying to survive as well, goes a long way.
Do you feel like it would be appropriate to say something like, I could get in trouble with my supervisor if I don't do this before you come in the room? Or would that just be a little too passive?
It's really contextual. I think reading the situation and the person, that angle could work, but it could also come off as threatening, right? So I think that's a great question, Ellen, and something that would be informed by the person, their energy, how comfortable you feel.
I think they would most likely laugh. They'd laugh at if they were being confrontational to begin with, they would just laugh and dismiss you then.
Yeah, and that is a read on the person, right? Are they just a self-involved individual who has narcissistic tendencies and that argument won't mean anything to them? Or do they need to kind of be snapped into, oh yeah, we're all struggling, we're all surviving together? Wouldn't it be wonderful if people just had that on their forehead so we knew how to approach them? But
maybe just say, this would only take 30 seconds. It's something I have to do. Let me just do it and get out of your hair.
Yes. So emphasizing the immediacy of it, right? Emphasizing that it won't be a big convenience. Let me just do it really quickly. Being very clear about the directive. Can someone speak to the gendered component here? How might gender? Bear with me, Nolan suggests.
Yeah, I know, the phrasing that Karen just used of don't worry, it'll just take me a second. To me, that feels like, as somebody who was a 19-year-old woman who would have probably frozen and just let them do what they want because I wouldn't want to get into it with them. Something I would imagine a more indirect kind of thing probably would be how I would approach it or would have approached it.
Absolutely. Indirect communication sometimes can be a softer way of enforcing a policy, right? And particularly when we think about young women, that is often a go-to response to conflict. Right. And this is not to say, and gosh, this isn't my gender comm class, but this is not to say that all women have feminine communication style and all men have masculine. We know that it's not confined to gender, it's interchangeable. Women can be direct, men can be indirect, right? I feel like I always have to say that in my class, probably not with you all, but okay, let's go to, go ahead, please.
I've had to discipline myself to adapt my style, you know, as particularly as a sole female, if I'm working with a lot of men. And I think I probably would consciously try to adopt a more direct style and just say, I'll be out of here in 30 seconds. I'm just going to do X and then I'll be gone.
Absolutely. I love that, Melanie. Similarly, I adopt a masculine style when it comes to academic contexts, right? Being direct. One thing that I've really had to unlearn is the very gendered feature of always saying I'm sorry, right? Sometimes there's not a space for I'm sorry, you just mean what you mean, right? So communication styles as really tools that we can use in diverse capacities to be more persuasive. Definitely. And I'm always telling my students, stop saying you're sorry, don't be sorry. Particularly women students tend to do that more. Okay, let's go to our third scenario. Okay. So the board who helped me organize this workshop had to help me with this scenario because the original one maybe wasn't as authentic to the library experience. And this is where my faculty capacity kind of shaped it, but here's the scenario. You're providing virtual assistance to a faculty member who becomes frustrated when you refer them to an interlibrary loan request for a book the library does not have access to. They angrily blame the issue on your competence and ask to speak to your supervisor. What do you do? What do y'all think? We're dealing with different authority levels all around, different roles in an institution.
My temptation is just to let my boss take the conflict, but no, Emily, if you're here, I am sorry.
Thanks, Aaron.
But I think, first of all, you would just be, you know, the empathetic nature, like, I'm sorry, it must be really frustrating that we don't have that for you right away. However, we can get it for you relatively quickly. Have you used interlibrary loan before? So I would try to redirect and just get moving on the ILL process. But.
No, absolutely. I think the kind of communicating the frustration first and foremost is a good response because you recognize what they're feeling, but emphasizing, you know, as a faculty member, you don't know everything about everything, right? Obviously coding that, you don't want to say it outright. That might escalate the situation. But I think being very clear, we can actually get this resource to you relatively quickly. We just have to go through this process. And then, of course, in some cases, it is perfectly acceptable to get your supervisor, right? If you need that support, depending on the situation. I see Lizanelle, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that. My response is generally, I'm happy to let you speak to my supervisor, but they will tell you the same thing. Yes, very that. I love that. That's like the retail flex, right? Let me see your boss, and you're thinking, they're gonna tell you the same thing, but sure, let me go get them. Right? And again, that's contextual, depending on the situation, the energy, but I think empathizing is a good first step because we don't know what that faculty member is going through.
I was taught that the word but, like the words at least, are escalators. So it's important when you apologize not to say I apologize, but, you know, I apologize, however. That's not good. Usually apologies are not that painful in a situation like this, so you just apologize. And like the earlier suggestion, I apologize the library doesn't have this book. We'd be happy to get it for you as soon as possible, you know, have you tried this or can we do this? And not do I apologize but is important because.
No, yeah, Mark, I completely agree with you. I think that that's a qualifier that often almost the sorry kind of loses its authenticity, right? It becomes more a filler to then tell you what I really want to tell you. So being cognizant of our language choices. And I'm sorry that the library, this process is a little bit longer. Let me tell you how I can help you, right? Instead of qualifying. I really wish we had every book too. I think that's a great way to diffuse the situation, Valerie. Recognizing that you are also someone who struggles with having resources at your disposal, right? It's not a you versus them issue. We're working in an environment to try to get you what you want, your resource. Amy says, yes, link phrases with and. I understand this is frustrating and I love it. And we can provide you with this other option. Very good. Good stuff. Okay.
I found that troubleshooting with them, like, oh, let me see if I can get the book this way, and walking them through that. And, whether it's interlibrary loan or seeing if you can order the book somewhere.
Yes. Karen, I love what you said. Troubleshooting and being explicit about how you're troubleshooting often goes a long way, right? Rather than staying quiet and kind of doing the work, maybe communicating the steps that you're taking so that they know you're taking it seriously, right? So always being explicit, these are the steps I'm taking right now. Let me look over here. Can do a lot to de-escalate a situation because they feel like they're being taken seriously, okay? And then the final, here's the information for us to get this. This is Sarah. Here's the information for us to get this for you sooner. And you can talk to your subject librarian about possibly purchasing this if you think we should have it. I love it. Yes. Going to a clear kind of direction to how we can resolve the issue versus just fixating on your perceived opinion about my competence, right?
Right. So one comment I had on this one was when I first read it, I imagined it to be like a text-based, like chat. Do you ever prefer maybe hopping on Zoom or having like a, because you mentioned the nonverbals is a really important piece. If somebody is trying to escalate a situation, at what point do you say, well, let's maybe hop on a phone call or hop on video and work through this so I can show you interlibrary loan or I can show you how this process works?
Yeah, I think making that option available to the person when you sense that escalation, right? Hey, chat feature, maybe we're not able to communicate as much as I'd like. Would you like to go on Zoom so I can help you through video conferencing? As long as the individual knows that they have options, they're less likely to escalate via texting. And what's interesting is, and I teach this in my communication studies class, how we communicate digitally is its own kind of landmine of communicating outside, right? Particularly younger generations will tell you emojis are 21st century communication tools that are being used like never before. But I would definitely offer that right away as soon as you recognize that text is not the best communication medium. Okay, let's do our last scenario, and then I promise it's Halloween weekend. Y'all can go party. Okay. Your library has a strict face mask policy that requires guests to wear a face mask at all times. You notice a woman is wearing her face mask like a chin strap and kindly ask the woman to ensure the face mask is covering her nose and mouth. The woman becomes irate and starts to accuse you of discrimination. She is getting incrementally louder. How would you respond to the situation? And I was trying to come up with a situation where now you're addressing someone in the community who came to the library to utilize the resources versus someone that works at the institution. What do you all think? Oh, Lizanelle comments, one of the challenges of the virtuals is that we're not getting the nonverbals. Absolutely agree. And what's interesting about those nonverbals though, now the read feature where people can see that you've read a text is communicating something. Your students will tell you that when someone messages you K versus OK, there's very different connotations associated to that as well. So texting as communicating different nonverbals than what we get from a face-to-face interaction. which I think is richer and I much prefer, but you know. So what do you all think? A community member is really upset at you asking them to please cover their nose and mouth.
I think I would try to stick to the main points that we need everybody to wear their face covering properly. I had a situation with a student where they were eating an apple and then they wanted to know what should they do with their apple, where should they go to eat their apple, and it spiraled quickly because they tried to, it was like all of a sudden the apple became my problem, where it's like, we were just need you to wear your face covering.
Yes. Wow. Okay. So this isn't too detached from your realities.
Well, and this was earlier on. I have noticed, I think people are generally better now, but this was earlier, like at the beginning of the school year. So.
Okay. What do you all think? I mean, and here's where oh, I see someone. Yeah. Linda?
We are discussing this all the time in our staff and faculty meetings because it's getting worse. People are using eating as an excuse. And so I just keep running around in my mind, what is the conversation I can have with somebody? Perhaps you should plan on eating before you come to the library. And, somebody in our earlier breakout group said that they are closing areas. They'll tape them off with red do not enter caution tape. Because, due to mask violations, this area is closed. And our library has added more signage on the floors that group gatherings take place. And people think that they can get away with not wearing masks because they're eating all the time. I can't, I'm eating. So I'm just wondering, perhaps you should do your eating somewhere else. It would be nice if you could eat before you came to study, then you can leave your mask on and study. I don't know.
No, and I get it. And I hear your frustration, Linda, particularly because it's probably a very common issue, right? That you experience in that setting. So maybe even changing the scenario, like let's change it to eating in a library setting when something that is not permitted. How would you approach that scenario? Particularly, let's assume that the student is flustered and upset and they just want to eat their apple.
I have been in this situation and I tell them the apple isn't like, the student isn't the problem, it's the policy is the food. So in like, kind of like Emily's situation, but this time the apple really is the problem. And then it's, but it was always, could you take that somewhere else? Could you go over here and do this? And yeah.
Yeah, and I think being concise, being directive, and being clear about what you want the student to do is a great first step. And most students will adhere to that, right? What if a student doesn't? What if, like Emily's student, this person starts saying, oh, the apple, what's wrong with the apple? Where should I throw it away? What are you doing? Where do you work? How could we de-escalate that situation, assuming the student did not listen to that first command?
I think Liz and Elle on chat had something where we maybe say we ask this of everyone and then kind of repeat the request again very directly. And if for some reason, that stop and find somebody that can help the situation. I think it is different too. Community members don't necessarily have the same agreements that somebody on campus has in terms of we might have students that would have to go see a dean or something if they misbehave, or because there are policies that say if they don't abide by the mask policies, then they do see maybe the dean of students. But the community members, I think, are a little different, where maybe I would ask for help a little sooner or something.
Yes, and that was actually kind of what I was hoping to get to. There's different stakes for community members, right? If someone is coming to the library and is engaging in conflict, and they're connected to the institution in some capacity. There are different processes in place to support you, right? But someone who isn't invested or maybe doesn't have that kind of authority over them, they're gonna not have a lot of stake in trying to resolve the issue. And so reading that situation, right? What Lizelle said with regards to repeating the question, I think this is a prime example of strategy number 4, right? When someone starts making the issue about something other than the issue, redirect, right? Redirect to the issue at hand. Don't engage in that power struggle, right? Be very clear about what you want, communicate the context, communicate that frustration that you're noticing or that anger. I know this is really difficult. I know you're really frustrated. I really need you to not be eating right now. This is a policy that we have, right? Don't get into that power struggle. I see Linda writes, then it is ineffectual and can be unsafe. Stop. Right? No, and I sense that frustration of just, come on, follow the rules. I completely get that. Okay, y'all, I really quickly just wanted to kind of leave a little bit of space in our last little bit together. If you had any questions or comments for me regarding these presentations, since you work in the library, if you'd like to see any of my references that I used as I developed this presentation. Yeah, I hope that these strategies were helpful. I'm happy to pass along my contact information should you have any comments or questions for me personally. Yeah, I think, Brandon, did you want to close off with anything?
Well, I think I want to just open it up to the group to see if there are lingering questions. I know one thing that came up with me is a lot of times we're seeing maybe it's not us that are having to deal with these conflicts, that it's maybe even student on student, maybe students are recognizing that somebody's not following the policy. How do you go about, or what are some strategies that you'd use in order to kind of address that if somebody maybe is taking ownership of that and you're kind of saying, okay, this is really the duty of the library to enforce these? Is that something where you change those strategies at all, or?
Yeah, I think one of the kind of major influences in any conflict is power and power dynamics, right? Whether a person wields power over another person is also going to impact how a conflict de-escalates or escalates. And if it is student on student, that could leave kind of a more gray area because they're pretty much on the same playing field, if you will. And so it's really, it's contextual. I think that these strategies are ones that I've employed a lot when I teach, particularly when conversation becomes really tense or hostile or heated. And it's really contextually based. But what I found is these strategies can absolutely be adapted. Unfortunately, I'd have to know more about the conflict, right, or the context to know how to adapt them. But for example, we're living in a very kind of bifurcated political cultural environment right now. And one way that I attempt to mediate conflict so it doesn't escalate is to establish guidelines for the class, right? Collectively create a code of conduct that we all will adhere to. And obviously that's not, you're not in a classroom setting, but Lizanelle writes, I think there are a lot of student employees on student interactions too. It's the service desk people who deal with this a lot, and they're often students who also work in the library. Yeah, so students, and particularly kind of that age dynamic, it's going to be more important for them to state their position relative to the library, to know that they are an authority figure, right? And they are responsible for adhering to the policies in place to keep everyone safe. But the student will have to state their title in a way that maybe someone who's older won't need to.
I've noticed too that the patrons who are like that, particularly community, but not necessarily, they're a lot meaner to the student workers, but as soon as you get a supervisor, even if they say the exact same thing, they're a lot nicer.
I couldn't agree more. As someone who is frequently confused for a student, I have been on the receiving end of this as well. Yes. And it's often, and that's why a student, it's going to be more important for them to say, this is my role here. I'm responsible for this. I know that you're very frustrated. I know that people are very impatient. We're doing this, however, to protect our community and those that are immune compromised, right?
I think one thing we've done is made sure we've had like our policies for how we proceed when people aren't following the kind of COVID policies. We've done it in a way where our goal is to make sure our student employees don't feel it all falls on them. So if it's like a first time offense, our student employee would address it, but the second time they do go get a staff person, because we recognize there is that power dynamic when they are it's a student employee trying to enforce policies on students. So we try to be really aware of that power dynamic for our student employees.
Yes, I love that, Emily. I think that is so important. And to communicate a clear strategy with your students before a conflict takes place, right? If there's someone who is irate, this is get one of us to help you, right? Don't put, you know, conflict is a scary thing in the moment, right? You almost kind of get into this fight or flight mode, and you might not be, you know, in a place to, okay, I need to contact my supervisor. But if there's a plan in motion, if the phone number for someone that they can call to for help is readily accessible, you'll be prepared in the event or when conflict arises. But I love that. I've been seeing a lot of these horror videos of retail workers or grocery workers who are tasked with the responsibility of enforcing policy. And, you know, these are people who are working minimum wage, just trying to do their job, and to see the ways they are treated, even, it's frustrating. Were there any other questions or comments? No? All right, well, I hope that you all found this to be extremely helpful. I had a great time with you all. Thank you all for engaging the content and for humoring me with participation. Have a wonderful weekend, everybody.
Thanks, Dr. Alvarado.
You're welcome.
I posted in the chat, there will be a recording of this available on our UALC website. And we also have an event next month on Friday, November 20th, where we'll be, after watching Shifting the Center, Transforming Academic Libraries Through Generous Accountability, we'll have a discussion with colleagues. So please join us if you're available for that next month. And thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and enjoy the weekend.
Yes, get some candy, y'all. Bye. Thank you all so much. And then Brandon, do you need me to hang back? Oh, I think you're muted. Let me unmute you.
Oh, sorry. Hi.
No worries.
I'm just making sure that the recording went through okay, but it looks like it did.